Hello, and welcome to the Wine Enthusiast Podcast, your serving of drinks culture and the people who drive it. I'm Jacy Topps. This week, we're talking about climate change and its impact on harvest. Wine is first and foremost an agricultural product, so extreme climates will undoubtedly alter wine production. Over the years, we've seen record temperatures, snowstorms in Napa and Sonoma, wildfires in North America, and floods in Australia and Germany. Climate change, both natural and man-made, is very much real. And its impact of wine production is becoming more and more obvious. So just how is it affecting wine? I sat down with Steve Peck to discuss. Steve is the VP of winemaking at Lohr Vineyards and Wines in Paso Robles, California, in which he oversees the full portfolio of Lohr wines. So listen on as Steve explains how he determines when it's time to harvest, the harvest process, just how extreme weather is impacting their crop this year, if climate change will ultimately impact their winemaking style, and what Lohr is doing to mitigate climate change in the vineyards. Every glass of wine tells a story. These stories reveal hidden histories, flavors, and passions, and sometimes they unravel our darkest desires. In Wine Enthusiast's newest podcast, Vinfamous, journalist Ashley Smith dissects the underbelly of the wine world. We hear from the people who know what it means when the products of love and care become the source of greed, arson, and even murder. Each episode takes listeners into the mysterious and historic world of winemaking and the crimes that have since become vinfamous. This podcast pairs well with wine lovers, history nerds, and crime junkies alike. So, grab a glass of your favorite wine and follow the podcast to join us as we delve into the twists and turns behind the all-time most shocking wine crimes. Follow Vinfamous on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen, and be sure to follow the show so you never miss a scandal. New episodes drop every other Wednesday. Hi, I'm Jacy Topps. Today we're discussing harvest and climate change. My guest is Steve Peck. Steve is the Vice President of Winemaking at Lohr Vineyards and Wine in Paso Robles. Welcome, Steve. I'm so glad you can join us today.
Thank you, Jacy. I sure appreciate the opportunity to spend some time with you.
So it's harvest season. It started all over the Northern Hemisphere, and the wine world is super excited and busy. For our listeners who aren't quite familiar with the process, can you quickly take us through the steps of harvest, like what goes into it and the decisions that need to be made? Because it's such a really vital component of winemaking.
Right. Yeah. At Lohr, we farm in three regions in California. Our original region is in the Monterey area. Today it's called the Arroyo Seco of Monterey. It's kind of like the Rodeo Drive, really one of the premium areas of Monterey. Very ideal climate for Chardonnay Pinot Noir. We have a 30-acre vineyard up in St. Helena, Napa Valley, and then actually 3,000 acres in Paso Robles dedicated primarily to Cabernet Sauvignon. So we have our own team of vineyard managers and viticulturalists that have been working throughout the year, from pruning to, irrigation protocols, shoot thinning, cluster thinning. And as we approach harvest, the drive is really to collect samples, get our winemakers, including myself, out into the fields, tasting and flavoring for the optimal level of maturity before we make our picking decisions. So we have just today received our first sample of red grapes for our laboratory here. It is going to be a late season in 2023. As hot as the climate's been throughout the interior of the United States, with record-breaking temperatures in every state, really, Texas and Colorado come to mind. What that does is actually creates this kind of giant sucking sound from the Pacific Ocean, and the jet stream brings in that much more cold air off of the ocean. So the coastal strip from Santa Barbara to Paso Robles Monterey, Sonoma, Napa, it's actually resulted in the coolest growing season we've had since 1999. So the entire state expects to have a later than normal harvest, again, because of that colder air being pulled in from the ocean.
Okay, so let's back up for a second. When you said you're picking grapes to that maturity, how do winemakers, how do you determine that perfect ripeness?
Right. So again, there is a level of analysis that we're kind of looking for a certain sweetness level or sugar level in the grapes. That kind of will result in how much alcohol is in the wine. But a brand like J. Lohr would go to the next level, which is really flavor maturity, and we want to have enough hang time on the vine to develop the appropriate flavor. So a classic one would be our Flume Crossing Sauvignon Blanc, where if we get the sugar just where it ought to be, if the fruit still kind of tastes grassy and green, it'll have some green pepper character to it, but it will not have developed some of the thiols, which is kind of the passion fruit aromas that we need to let the fruit have additional hang time on the vine to achieve. So that's a classic one where myself and Christian Barnheisel, our winemaker for white wines, were really on patrol for the development of those passion fruit aromas in Sauvignon Blanc. For Chardonnay, we're looking for going from sort of green apple to maybe more of a peach or nectarine kind of flavor profile. In red grapes, our team and myself included, we've sort of developed a really interesting take, which is we're tasting grapes from veraison, which is around August 1st, where the grapes turn from green to red. We're starting to taste at that point for any negative flavors, which would include that green bell pepper aroma. And so if we get a nice fruity flavor profile on August 1st, we know we're set for the season. If we get that green bell pepper flavor, we actually starve the vines from any irrigation, and we'll put them through a drying cycle to try to wring out some of that green bell pepper flavor. But when it comes down to the final day of harvest for red grapes, the technique's pretty interesting. We will pop a few grapes in our mouth, chew it up, and spit it out. And if the juice comes out of my mouth kind of green or pink, it means it's not ready. If the juice that you spit out is nice and dark red, it means that the color in those skins is ready to roll. And we're going to have a really easy time in the fermenter. We're going to be able to, that those grapes are going to surrender the color into the juice very easily, and that we're not going to have to overwork the wine, which to get the color, and which would drive our flavor profile to a more of a tannic, over extracted flavor profile.
I like how you describe that. It just, like you guys have your it's like your wine tasting in the vineyards, and you put it in and you spit it out, just how wine reviewers do it the same way.
Yeah, yeah, it's not a a pretty process. you know, part of that process might be looking for the development of seed color. So if the seeds are still kind of white and pithy, they tend to impart a bitter flavor profile. If they have this nice, brown, kind of toasty look to them, they're going to render wines with really soft and approachable tannins.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Verazion because you said it's typically the beginning of August. With climate change, is that impacted a little bit or is it not? Is it typically the first week of August?
Right. So you use the term climate change, and that is the correct term. 10 years ago we would have been talking about global warming,
Global
because we
warming, yeah.
talked about, that, the hot interior United States has kind of resulted in a colder coastal strip along California. And so, yeah, it can vary, maybe, you know, plus or minus 10 days. If we've had a dry winter, the vines tend to come out of dormancy a little earlier, that bud break. So about the earliest is St. Patty's Day, and about the latest is a little after April Fool's. So you tend to hedge, more towards that, mid-March bud break on a dry winter, and again maybe into the first week of April on a wetter winter like we had in 2023. So there is kind of a, that the starting point of the whole entire growing season, and that'll play through to the bloom period that happens typically in May. Most people don't really think of grapevines as a flowering plant, but
Hmm.
indeed it is. It has these teeny tiny little flowers, and just like a cherry blossom, ideally every blossom will turn into a piece of fruit, into a grape or into a cherry. And so that process tends to be plus or minus May 15th. And then again, that veraison, which is where we go from these hard, sour green berries to, soft, colored and sweet berries, begins, anywhere from say July 25th to maybe August 8th, somewhere in that period. And this year, we're on that late side of that spectrum.
Okay, so as far as the maturity and the ripening of the grapes, what type of weather impacts it? Is it excessive heat, excessive moisture, frost? Like what slows down the ripening or what speeds up the ripening?
Right. So there's this kind of Goldilocks temperatures band, say from about 70 to about 85 degrees Fahrenheit. And so the more hours of the day that you spend in that little window of temperature, typically the higher the color development's going to be. It takes about 2 weeks from the onset of raisin for all the grapes to turn from green to red. And if we have a nice moderate temperature window, again, it doesn't matter if the daily high might be 90 or 95 or even 100, as long as you have plenty of hours, daytime hours, in that 70 to 85 degree Fahrenheit window. So we've gone back and looked at our records over the years, and when we have a period of that 2 week period of raison where they're turning from green to red, if we have a higher number of hours in that nice temperate zone of temperature, we see an explosion of color development in the grapes and in the wines that we produce 2 months later.
Okay. So you said it was hotter this year in Paso, or is it warmer? I'm
It's
sorry, you said colder.
colder.
It's
It's
colder.
cold. In fact, it's colder. Yeah, in Paso, and again, most of the wine growing regions in California are actually colder in 2023 than normal.
Wow, that's so interesting.
Yeah, it really is. And again, that's where that term climate change is a better descriptor than global warming, because as hot as it is. I mean, the glaciers are melting. They're setting regular heat temperatures, wildfires in Canada and the Rockies. Again, that general heat in the interior of the United States is actually, again, pulling colder air off the Pacific and onto the landmass along the California coastline, that maybe 20 or 35-mile strip from the Pacific Ocean all the way from Santa Barbara to Mendocino.
And now a word from our sponsor. Spend a weekend exploring some unfamiliar grape stomping grounds. Located just minutes west of Portland, in Oregon's famed Willamette Valley, experience an exceptional and intimate world of wine in Tualatin Valley. Uncover more than 30 world-class wineries without the crowds. Savor dozens of different varieties, all locally grown and produced in the Pacific Northwest. Explore Tualatin Valley at tualatinvalley.org. tualatinvalley.org. I know that winemakers basically harvest grapes for like the white grapes are harvested earlier for the lighter wines, and the red grapes are harvested a little later. Is there a more significant fluctuation in those harvest times because of climate change, because of the colder weather this year?
Yeah, we're not growing our white grapes in the same region that we grow our red grapes. So again, we growing Chardonnay and Sauvignon Blanc in the cool climate of Monterey to begin with. So our harvest for those grapes is roughly around the same time that we're ripening Cabernet in Paso Robles in that warmer region. That said, the climate change effect is real. We fully believe in it. In some instances, in 2022, for example, we had record-setting temperatures the first week of September, with temperatures reaching an unprecedented 105, even 110 degrees in some parts of our vineyards in Monterey. In that case, you would think that the grapes would just ripen really fast, but it doesn't actually work that way. The leaves on a grapevine or pretty much any plant, you have that sort of shiny side that's facing the sun, and then the backside of the leaf is kind of this dull, fuzzy side. And on that backside they're called stomates or stomata, so essentially like sweat pores. And when it gets 105 degrees, those pores, they close down and the vines just hibernate. And so we actually see a pause in our ripening development when we see temperatures north of 100 degrees, and the vines just kind of go on lockdown. They stop photosynthesizing and they kind of go into a survival mode. So it really is interesting. You would think that hot weather would just propel things to ripeness, but it doesn't actually work that way. Again, you're outside of that. You don't have enough hours in that really sweet spot Goldilocks area between 70 and 85 degrees, and the vines actually kind of are not that productive in hot weather.
That is so fascinating.
Yeah, it's not intuitive. It's not an intuitive science.
Yeah, and so you said you have acres planted in different regions throughout California. Is that correct?
Right, with 3,000 acres of red grapes in Paso Robles. Lohr also has about 1,000 acres that we own and farm in the Monterey Arroyo Seco region, and then a little over 30 acres up on Pratt Avenue in St. Helena in Napa Valley.
So I'm interested to know about in the Napa Valley acres because, Napa had a lot of snow. Napa and Sonoma had a lot of snow this winter.
That's right. Yeah.
And did that impact? I mean, like, you had a lot more than New York City. I'm here in New York City, and like our mouths were just open. It was insane. Did that impact in the vineyards at all?
It's during the dormant season, so it makes for nice photojournalism. But the vines are, they're tucked away nicely for their winter hibernation, and so even when we do get an anomaly like snow in the vineyards, it really doesn't upset the apple cart as long as the vines are dormant. So, but it is beautiful to see.
So you said that you were harvesting a little later this year. How much later are you going to be harvesting?
We're sort of forecasting that we will finish harvest 10th of November, where last year we were done by October 20th. So do the math on that. That's 20 days or so different, 3 weeks, 3 weeks different. That said, we haven't picked a single grape, so what was it, Mike Tyson that said everybody's got a plan until they
Right,
get punched in the
exactly.
face. But we always live in hope that this is going to be the best vintage ever. Nothing's happened so far in 2023 that would prevent that. But again, if it ends up being a wet October, or we have a frost come through, or some heat waves, we'll have to adapt our plan and really work our magic in the winery to take average quality grapes, and make the best of it, rather than some of the great vintages like 2021. We had a great string of vintages in 2012, 2013, 2014, where the wines were just made in the vineyard. They were just beautiful all the way through their life. Where we have other more difficult vintages. 22 would be one of those where we talk about it being the winemaker's vintage. So it's really at that point it's up to the winemaker to use their finesse, their blending skills to really adapt the wine style to really come up with something that people will enjoy.
Yeah, that was definitely my next question. If you have to pick, earlier or later, or when you do pick, it's not the ultimate maturity level that you needed. How is that impacted in the fermentation process? Is it more sugar, less acidity, or vice versa?
Yeah, well, the first thing we'll do is, every vineyard is not just entirely uniform. So if we've got a vineyard that's got, some little hills and valleys, a brand like J. Lohr, we're going to send our team in there to pick out the hillsides separately and let the fruit in the valley that's not heat stressed, have the time on the vine to completely reach, ideal maturity. The fancy word for that is called a differential harvest. So that's definitely early in our playbook. But you're right, as far as what arrives at the winery, fruit that's been exposed to too much heat, we'll see higher alcohols in the wines, lower acidity. The wines are actually quite lovely in that first 6 months in the winery, but they don't always have the freshness or the structure to really be ageable. So we again adapt. One of the things you might do if the entire vintage was affected that way, you might say, okay, well, maybe 18 months is our normal time in barrel. We're going to do 14 months instead. Get these wines, out of barrels and into the bottle to preserve some freshness. That would be a standard playbook for us for a hot vintage.
Okay. So, what is J-Lord doing in the vineyards to mitigate or adapt to climate change?
A couple of things. Rootstock selection is a big thing where you have some rootstocks that are more drought tolerant than others. You only get to make that decision once, right? It's what
Right.
it's that's a planting decision. We've also gone to adapted a number of our vineyards where you can picture a row of vines and there's a little irrigation hose that runs along the bottom of the stakes there, and you'd have a little water dripper at each vine. We've kind of gone to where we actually will have, in most cases, two hoses. So again, if the fruit up on the hillside in that row needs water, we can just water those vines that need water and not the entire row. So let's say some of the vines are down kind of on lower ground, heavier soil. They're good. We don't need to water every vine in that row. So that's one example. We've got another one where, the grapes tend to grow upright naturally, but there's typically a cross arm and a wires that trellising that'll hold those shoots in that upward position. We've kind of gone to these ones where they're about 2 foot long, projecting to the south side of the vine row, and maybe only 6 inches to the north side. So it almost acts like the brim of a baseball hat, to where we've kind of tilted the grapevine architecture to kind of create a little bit more shade on the sunny side of the vine, the south facing side of the vine. Just like, at my house, for sure. I mean, I've got the porch on the south side of the house, and I've got the one on the north side. On a hot afternoon, my family and I, we sit out on the shady side of the house, right? We don't, we're not sitting out there in the blazing sun. So we've kind of adapted the trellis architecture a little bit to, sort of address that.
Okay. So, pretty much every winery has its own style, and I know J. Lohr has its own style. Do you think climate change will ultimately affect your style of winemaking? Are you thinking about maybe 10, 15, 20 years down the road, would you adapt a new style of winemaking, a new J-Lor style?
Well, we are certainly open to, you know, looking at other varieties that can, sort of support our brand. Cabernet Franc's an example. The flavor profile is a lot like Cabernet Sauvignon, um, but it is we actually, some varieties demand more water than others just naturally. We
Mhm.
talk about Syrah, for example, from the Rhone Valley. We talk about that being kind of the Hummer of grapevines. In other words, it's the gas guzzler. Syrah goes through, it just plows through water. And Cabernet Franc, we refer to it as the Prius, meaning it's really economical.
Yeah.
And so we've actually slowly expanded our Cabernet Franc plantings and are finding more utility for it. The fruit ends up getting blended into our Cabernet Sauvignon program, into our Merlot program in, kind of 5% quantities. But we do value our experience with growing that variety and would lean into that if the climate change does continue, and we've got experience with Cabernet Franc, and we know that it's going to allow us to save water. It's not going to demand as much irrigation in the vineyard, and it's going to be a little bit more heat tolerant to these hotter temperatures that we see in the vineyards. But again, this coastal strip where Paso Robles lies, it may not play out to actually get hotter here. It may actually play out that we get cooler again because of that draft that the interior of the United States has created for us to pull yet more cold air off the Pacific Ocean. So it's not entirely as sort of intuitive as you might think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Steve, I have one more question for you.
Uh-huh.
When all the grapes are pressed and everything's in the tank fermenting and harvest season is over and it's been a success, what's in your glass? What are you drinking?
Well, I already kind of tipped my hat to my excitement around Cabernet Franc. We also grow a few Rhone varieties here at J. Lohr that can be really refreshing. We have a new kind of luxury iconic release called J. Lohr Signature Cabernet Sauvignon. So if I really feel like pampering myself and allowing myself to just feel good about all the hard work I've put in, like, in the situation you describe, I've kind of fought the fight of harvest. I've been up early and been on that hyper vigilant watch of our crop and our winemaking, and I really want to reward myself. That's the bottle I'm going to pull out, is the J. Lohr Signature Cabernet.
Yeah, and I know that you guys deserve it, all the hard work.
Yeah,
Steve,
thank
thank
you.
you so much for joining us. It's been such a pleasure talking to you.
JC, it was a delight. Thank you.
I wish you a very happy and healthy harvest season.
Okay, and thank you, JC, and I really appreciate the opportunity again to talk with you.
The story of climate change is not just one of elevated temperatures. There's smoke taint, droughts, frost, flooding, hailstorms, and excessive rainfall. They're all impacting the wine vineyards. Climate change is very real, and it's only accelerating. Sure, advances in technology and better scientific understanding of how grapes are grown are certainly helping winemakers adapt to climate change. But ultimately, it's on all of us to help mitigate it. What are your thoughts? If you liked today's episode, we'd love to read your reviews and hear what you think. You can email us your comments and questions at podcast@wineenthusiast.net. And hey, why not tell your wine-loving friends to check us out too? Remember, you can subscribe to this podcast on Apple, Google, Spotify, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. You can also go to wineenthusiast.com/podcast for more episodes and transcripts. I'm Jacy Topps. Thanks for listening.